So we are almost out of our depression, but we are not quite out of it yet. And we still want to talk about labor standards and Franklin's attempt to stack the court. So the Supreme Court is set. Right now we have 9 justices, and that's pretty solidly how it's been for a while now. But there isn't really anything that could keep them at 9. We could override that pretty easily. So Franklin, in his day, wants to do what they call stacking the court, and he wants to reorganize the court. Now, if you follow the Constitution at all, you know that once you are appointed as a Supreme Court justice, you have that job for life unless you are impeached, you resign, or you die. If you don't do one of those 3 things, then you have that job for life. Which means that if you are appointed by a president when you're 20 and you live to be 90, you can be a Supreme Court justice for the rest of your life. And Franklin doesn't necessarily have an issue with this. He has an issue with the age of the justices. And so he wants to stack the courts so that he can appoint an additional justice for each justice that is over 70 and a half years old. Now, at the time, if this plan were to go through, this would allow Franklin Roosevelt to add 6 more Supreme Court justices to the court system. And you may think, well, who cares? But again, if you follow our Constitution, everybody should know that the Supreme Court is the one who determines what is constitutional and what is not. And the justices are usually party affiliated to some extent. So if you can appoint justices that are more affiliated with your party beliefs, it is more likely that they are going to pass and find more laws constitutional that agree with and align with your beliefs. And a lot of people are upset with this, especially the Congress. They say this is a massive attempt to tamper with the system of checks and balances. It will far overreach executive power, and it will give the president far too much power. So we don't want to do it, and the Congress refuses to pass the bill. The court reorganization plan is the first bill of Franklin Roosevelt's that does not get passed since he took office. Then we also have labor unions and workers' rights, because those things are always at the forefront of a problem when there is an economic issue. And so we already have the labor unions. We got those back in the Gilded Age, but they're facing some problems. They've kind of been on the downfall, right? And so the Committee of Industrial Organizations, which used to be part of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. They break off, although I think they've reunited since then. They are going to focus on working with unskilled workers in auto and textile and steel industries to get those workers more pay. And they want to make sure that labor practices are protected, because we all know that when things go wrong, the first people who suffer usually are the unprotected laborers. If you are an employee at will, you can be fired whenever you want. Well, not whenever you want, whenever they want. So they are going to work with these unskilled workers to make sure they get a fair treatment. And so they are pushing for the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standard Act is going to establish regulations on business and interstate commerce. It is going to ask for the 40-hour maximum work week. And if you surpass 40 hours, you have to get paid extra for overtime. You don't just make your own pay. You get double pay for overtime, or not double pay, but time and a half. It also establishes for the very first time a minimum wage. Minimum wage is, at its core, is the minimum amount of money a person needs to make per hour working a 40-hour work week to be able to afford the cost of living in the United States. That is what minimum wage was created to be. That is what it is supposed to be. In 1935, it was 40 cents an hour. 40 cents an hour for 40 hours a week, you would be able to live comfortably. You could afford to have a house or pay rent, buy a car, and raise a family. That was the whole point of minimum wage. Minimum wage today no longer serves that purpose. And it is an oversight and really an insult to American working people, because the whole point of minimum wage, again, is that you can afford on one job, on one salary, 40 hours a week, to be able to afford the cost of living. And we can thank Franklin Roosevelt for that, although it's no longer that. We also, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, get child labor restrictions on people under 16, which really is a good thing because, our child labor for over 16 or until that point is still pretty loose. Side note, as far as I know, minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour at the federal level. In different states, it is higher, but overall, it's $7.25 an hour, and that has not been the affordable wage to live in America since, I don't know, maybe 1970, maybe not even then. So the way they accomplish this is through sit-down strikes. Now, we talked about strikes in the other unit, but a sit-down strike is different because the workers are going on strike by going to work. And instead of protesting from outside, they are going into their job. But when they get in there, they're not doing their work. They're just sitting there. And they are doing this, so they're occupying the building. So you can't send in strike breakers, but they're not actually working. And you can't fire everybody. You cannot. So the sit-down strikes work. They get us the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is what we are looking for at the time. And by 1936, the New Deal is on its way, and people say it's working, but there's bigger issues in Europe that may be a bigger cause of the end of the Depression than the actual New Deal. And it's one of those things where if you ask historians, like some people will argue that the New Deal and the WPA are what ended the Depression, and other people will say it was World War II that ended the Depression. And once again, I allow you to make your own choices on that, but we are going to talk about World War II next as we wrap up this unit.